While my family celebrated my death and divided my assets, I was recovering in a foreign hospital. Now my sister, ex-husband, and parents are furious I walked into their fraud trial as the prosecution's surprise witness. Hi everyone. Before we dive in, show some love by subscribing and commenting where in the world you're joining us from. Alright, let's get back to the story. I remember the rain hitting my windshield like angry fists. That Tuesday evening, everything changed in 7 seconds. I was driving home from the medical clinic where I worked as a cardiac nurse for 15 years. My hands were still marked with the scent of sanitizer when the truck ran the red light. The collision wasn't an accident. It was my reckoning. When I woke up in that foreign hospital in Mexico, yes, I'd been on a medical mission. My body was shattered. Both legs broken, 3 ribs fractured, a punctured lung. The doctor said I was lucky. Lucky seemed like a cruel joke. But the physical pain? Nothing compared to what awaited me back home. My family found out through the accident report. My name was listed, my vehicle was identified, but my face? Unrecognizable. The hospital's records were chaotic. Understaffed, underfunded. Communication delays meant my family received partial information. They got enough to believe I was dead but not enough to confirm I was alive. I was unconscious for 17 days. When I finally regained consciousness, I tried calling. My phone was destroyed in the crash. I asked the nurses to contact my family. Their English was limited. My family's responses to the hospital were, I later learned, coldly strategic. They asked about my will, my bank accounts, my property. Not whether I'd survived. My sister Margaret, always the lawyer with her sharp suits and sharper tongue, took charge immediately. She legally declared me deceased. My ex-husband Derek, remarried within 6 months to my former friend Crystal, began moving into our house. My parents, who should have moved heaven and earth to find me, instead moved my furniture. They divided me like I was inheritance. The funeral happened while I was learning to walk again, my legs screaming in rebellion against gravity. They had a closed casket because there was no body. Just a memorial service where my mother apparently wore black silk and accepted condolences like she'd lost her favorite handbag, not her daughter. What I didn't know then was that Margaret's role in my death wasn't accidental. Neither was Derek's sudden enthusiasm for my estate. This is where my story begins. Not in that hospital bed, but in the moment I realized I wasn't the victim of tragedy. I was the victim of conspiracy. By week 4 in that foreign hospital, I was piecing together fragments from other patients, nurses, and my own fragmented memories. The hospital staff didn't understand the gravity of what was happening. They were focused on my physical recovery, on getting me to move my toes, to take another step. But I was focused on something else. Survival. Not just physical but emotional. A nurse named Elena, bless her soul, she spoke broken English and had the most compassionate eyes. She showed me something that changed everything. A newspaper clipping she'd saved from the hospital's waiting room. My obituary. My beautiful face, my carefully curated biography, my life summarized in 8 paragraphs. But the details were wrong. It said I was worth $3 million. It mentioned my life insurance policy worth $2 million. It detailed my property portfolio like I was some real estate mogul. I'd never read anything so painfully inaccurate about myself. You are a very rich woman? Elena asked innocently. I laughed, actually laughed, and then I wept like I'd never wept before. That's when I realized this wasn't about love or family bonds. This was about money. Cold, calculated money. My hands started shaking as I pieced it together. Margaret with her law degree and her connections. Derek, my husband of 8 years, the man I'd supported through graduate school while working double shifts. My parents, who'd always resented my independence, my success, my refusal to let them control me. They hadn't looked for me because they didn't want to find me. The detective that came later, a kind woman named Officer Santos, she confirmed what I suspected. The hospital had finally contacted the American embassy. The embassy verified my identity through dental records. And that's when the legal machinery started moving in the opposite direction. The paperwork was staggering. I was simultaneously alive and dead. My death certificate needed to be revoked. My will, which Margaret had already filed in probate, had to be challenged. My bank accounts, which my parents had begun liquidating, had to be frozen pending investigation. I remember the moment Officer Santos told me about my family's behavior. She was professional but visibly angry. Your sister forged your signature on several documents. Your ex-husband transferred your house title without legal authority. Your parents attempted to liquidate your retirement accounts. I asked her the question that haunted me, why didn't they look for me? She looked at me with such profound sadness. Because they were too busy dividing your life. Recovery took 4 months. 4 months of physical therapy that felt like punishment, of learning to walk again, of rebuilding my body while my mind spiraled through scenarios of confrontation. The U.S. Embassy assisted with my medical evacuation back home. They arranged everything legally, officially, with documentation that left no room for argument. My family didn't know I was coming. I learned this through a detective named James who'd been assigned to my case. He was thorough, methodical, his notebook perpetually filled with details that painted a portrait of calculated betrayal. James would visit me in my hospital room, initially just to gather information, but eventually we became unlikely friends. He explained the legal complexities of what my family had attempted. Margaret had accelerated my will through probate using forged documents. She'd claimed power of attorney based on fabricated medical records suggesting I was mentally incompetent. Derek had transferred my property deed with false signatures. My mother had accessed my bank accounts through social engineering, convincing bank employees she had authority as my mother. My father had taken out a second mortgage against my house without my knowledge. It was elaborate. It was organized. It was intentional. This wasn't impulsive, James explained, sitting in the uncomfortable hospital chair that had become his regular spot. This was planned. When they received the accident report, they moved immediately. Within 48 hours, Margaret had filed paperwork declaring you deceased. Within a week, Derek was consulting real estate agents about selling your property. The timeline proved premeditation. What shattered me most was learning about the insurance claim. My life insurance policy had a clause. If I died before age 50, the beneficiary received triple the policy value. They'd taken out an additional policy on me 6 months before the accident, something I'd never authorized. Margaret had forged my signature on that document too. $3 million suddenly became $5 million. They were betting on your death, James said quietly, and I heard the anger underneath his professional tone. This wasn't grief. This wasn't a family protecting itself during tragedy. This was predatory behavior. I spent those waiting months in physical therapy rebuilding my legs while rebuilding my resolve. I attended therapy, actual mental health therapy, with a kind woman named Dr. Harmony who helped me process the trauma. She didn't minimize my family's actions. Instead, she validated my feelings while keeping me grounded in logic. They are responsible for their choices, Dr. Harmony said during one session. But you are responsible for how you respond to their choices. Revenge will feel good momentarily. Justice will feel good indefinitely. That distinction saved me. 7 months after the accident, I was walking with minimal pain. My apartment, a temporary one arranged by victim services, was becoming familiar. I was rebuilding slowly, methodically, with the support of people who actually cared about my survival. Then the phone call came. The prosecution team had been building a case against my family for fraud, attempted theft, and conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming. Digital records, forged documents, the suspicious timing of actions taken after my death was announced. The assistant district attorney, a sharp black woman named Prosecutor Williams with a reputation for bringing down white-collar criminals, wanted to meet with me. We're building an airtight case, she said during our first meeting in a sleek downtown office. But we need you. You're the victim. You're the truth they can't deny. I remember the sensation of that moment, something shifting inside me. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about accountability. It was about ensuring that what happened to me became a cautionary tale, a line that couldn't be crossed. What happens if I testify? I asked. Prosecutor Williams laid it out clearly. My testimony would be devastating to their defense. They'd claim confusion, mistake, legal misunderstanding. My living, breathing presence on the witness stand would obliterate those claims. The prosecution wanted to make a statement. You cannot exploit tragedy for profit without consequences. Your family is going to face serious charges, Williams said. Your sister faces felony fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Your ex-husband faces similar charges. Your parents face financial fraud and elder financial abuse statutes. Your family is going to prison. The words should have felt triumphant. Instead, they felt heavy. I agreed to testify, and then the prosecution did something unexpected. They kept my participation secret. No leaked information. No media preparation. No warning to the defense team. When the trial date was set for 3 weeks out, my family had no idea I was alive, much less that I'd be the prosecution's ace card. Detective James provided me with case files. I spent nights reading through evidence of my own betrayal, highlighted passages showing me exactly how calculated, how systematic, how deliberate my family's actions had been. Each document was a brick in the wall between us, and I built that wall myself, one brick at a time. There was no turning back now. The night before the trial began, I couldn't sleep. I found myself on my apartment's small balcony, staring at the city lights, remembering when everything was different. When my family meant safety instead of danger. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood where my parents worked hard but never quite had enough. My father was a mechanic. My mother was a teacher's aide. We were comfortable but not wealthy. I was the oldest. My sister Margaret came 3 years later. My brother Jason came after that. He died at 12 from leukemia, and that death fractured our family in ways we never healed. After Jason's death, something shifted. My parents became protective to the point of controlling. They wanted to keep me close to prevent any further loss. I wanted to escape, to breathe, to live. That conflict defined my adolescence. I put myself through nursing school by working as a care aide and taking out loans. I built a career through ambition and sacrifice. I married Derek young, too young, because my parents approved and I desperately wanted their blessing for once. That marriage lasted 8 years because I spent most of it trying to make it work instead of acknowledging it was broken. My family never celebrated my success. They just waited for me to fail so they could say, "I told you so." Margaret went to law school because I succeeded professionally, but she resented me the entire way. She'd make comments about my work being emotional labor instead of real work. She'd mention my student loans in conversations with our parents, highlighting my financial stress even after I'd paid them off. Derek resented my work schedule. He resented my paycheck being larger than his initially. He resented my independence, my refusal to ask permission to have my own life. He began staying late at the office, and when I finally found the text messages, he didn't apologize. He said I'd driven him to it through my coldness. My parents resented my refusal to let them move in, to control my life, to keep me bounded to their expectations. They called my independence selfishness. They called my success luck. They called my boundaries disrespect. For years I'd internalized their narrative. Maybe I was too ambitious. Maybe I was too cold. Maybe I was wrong to want more than what they'd offered me. The accident revealed the truth. I wasn't the problem. They were. The courthouse was colder than I expected. Everything was marble and wood and the weight of justice. I sat in the witness waiting room, my hands trembling slightly. A victim advocate named Patricia held my hand and reviewed my testimony one more time. Patricia was a 60-something-year-old woman with gray locks and wisdom in her eyes. She guided me through this entire process with the kind of compassion only someone who'd survived something similar could offer. "You're going to be okay," Patricia said. "You're going to walk in there and you're going to tell the truth. That's all you need to do." Prosecutor Williams appeared at 9:47 a.m. "They're ready for you." Walking into that courtroom was like walking into a dream where everything was familiar but fundamentally wrong. The gallery was packed with media, with curious observers, with people who'd sensed the scandal and come to witness it unfold. I looked for my family. Margaret sat at the defense table, her sharp suit now looking like armor. Her face went pale, actually went white when she saw me. Derek was beside her, his mouth literally falling open. My mother gasped so loudly that the judge called for order. My father stared at me like I was a ghost, and technically I was the ghost of their conspiracy. The prosecutor called me to the stand. I took the oath with my hand on the Bible, even though I wasn't particularly religious, and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Then Prosecutor Williams asked me the first question: "Please state your name and occupation for the record." I looked directly at my family and spoke clearly. "My name is Nikira Mitchell. I'm a cardiac nurse. And I'm alive." The courtroom erupted. The next 6 hours were brutal. Prosecutor Williams walked me through my testimony methodically. She asked me about the accident, my hospitalization, the medical details of my recovery. She asked me about my family, specific questions about conversations about inheritance, discussions about money. Each answer was a nail in their coffin. Then came the documents. Williams presented evidence of Margaret's forged signatures, Derek's unauthorized property transfers, my mother's fraudulent bank account access, my father's secret second mortgage. With each document she asked me, "Did you authorize this?" The answer was always no. The defense attorneys were vicious. Margaret's lawyer, a dismissive man named Richard Chin, tried to twist my narrative. He suggested I was confused from my injuries, that I might be misremembering my family's intentions. He implied I was seeking revenge. He tried to paint my family as concerned relatives who were simply trying to manage an estate during a crisis. "Isn't it true," Chin asked, his tone dripping with condescension, "that you and your sister had a difficult relationship? That you were always competing with each other?" I took a breath. Dr. Harmony's voice echoed in my mind. "Stay grounded in truth." I answered carefully, "We had a complicated relationship, yes. But complicated relationships don't give family members the right to commit fraud." Derek's attorney tried a different approach. She suggested that Derek was a victim too, that he'd been manipulated by other family members. She tried to create daylight between Derek and the rest of my family. I understood the strategy: make the jury sympathetic to at least one defendant. But I was prepared. I described how Derek had been the first to contact the real estate agent about selling my house. I detailed the conversations I'd overheard between Derek and Margaret discussing the life insurance payout. I presented evidence that Derek had taken out a loan against my house the day after my death was confirmed. Daylight collapsed under the weight of evidence. My parents' attorney didn't ask many questions. Her strategy seemed to be minimizing their involvement, suggesting they were elderly and confused, that they'd followed Margaret's lead. The jury wasn't buying it. The transfer records showed my mother had specifically called my bank and used detailed information to access my accounts. That wasn't confusion. That was intentionality. When Prosecutor Williams asked me about my parents' reaction when they learned of my death, I answered honestly. My mother said, "Well, at least she had good insurance." That was her first comment. Not sadness. Not shock. Insurance. The courtroom went silent. By day 3 of testimony, I was emotionally exhausted. The defense had called into question my memory, my motivation, my credibility. They'd suggested I was a vengeful woman trying to destroy her family out of spite. They'd implied that maybe I'd faked my recovery, that maybe I'd been plotting this the entire time. That's when Prosecutor Williams asked the final question. The one we'd discussed in preparation, the one she saved for maximum impact. "Nikira, if your family hadn't committed these crimes, if they'd simply waited for you to recover, would you have chosen to cut them out of your life?" I took several seconds before answering. The truth was complicated. My family had hurt me in countless ways before the accident. They'd been emotionally neglectful, financially controlling, and generally toxic. But I'd still loved them, still hoped they'd change, still harbored fantasies that one day they'd see me as someone worthy of genuine affection. The accident had stripped away those fantasies. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But I would have had the choice. They took that choice away from me. They didn't just betray me. They conspired against me. They used my trauma as an opportunity for profit. And they would have gotten away with it if I hadn't survived." My voice cracked on the last sentence. I watched Margaret cover her face with her hands. I watched Derek stare at the table. I watched my mother weep. Were those genuine tears or performance tears? I'd spent so many years trying to decode her emotions that I could no longer trust my interpretation. The worst part, I continued, is that they didn't grieve me. They celebrated me. They treated my death like a lottery win. That's what breaks me the most. I was disposable to them. The courtroom was completely silent. Even the judge seemed moved. During the break, Patricia brought me water. "You did incredible," she said. That was powerful testimony. But I felt hollow. Speaking the truth didn't feel empowering. It felt like watching my family implode, and despite everything, there was a small part of me that still wanted to reach out and save them. That part of me was, I realized, exactly what had allowed them to hurt me in the first place. Days 4 and 5 of the trial featured testimony from financial experts, investigators, and bank employees. Their evidence was damning. The prosecution presented a timeline that showed my family's actions were not reactive but proactive. Margaret had begun investigating probate law 2 weeks before my accident. Derek had scheduled a consultation with a real estate agent 5 days after my death was officially announced. 5 days. The bank employee, a nervous woman named Susan, testified that my mother had called and essentially lied about my mental state to gain access to my accounts. She said her daughter had been declared incapacitated, Susan explained, and she needed to access accounts to manage medical bills. She knew my daughter's social security number, her account numbers, details that she wouldn't know unless she had actually accessed the accounts before. It was premeditation. Everything pointed to planning. My brother-in-law testified. Margaret's husband, a man I'd always liked, and his testimony was devastating. He revealed that Margaret had discussed potential scenarios after my accident before she knew I was dead. He recalled her saying, "If Nikira doesn't make it, we need to be prepared." He testified that he'd felt uncomfortable with how quickly she'd moved to declare me deceased without exhausting all avenues to find me. I asked her why we weren't checking with international hospitals, my brother-in-law said quietly. She said it was better not to get false hope. False hope. She'd deliberately chosen not to look for me. The medical evidence was presented. My hospital records clearly showed my identity, my condition, my status as a live patient. The defense tried to claim the hospital had concealed my identity, an absurd claim that the hospital administrator immediately refuted. The hospital's inadequate communication systems had created a gap, but that gap hadn't hidden me. My family had simply never tried hard enough to find me. Prosecutor Williams asked the hospital administrator a specific question. If Nikira's family had contacted you claiming their loved one was missing after an accident, what would your protocol have been? We would have checked all patients admitted that day, accessed our records, and confirmed or denied the presence of the individual, the administrator responded. There was no attempt by anyone in her family to do that. Not one inquiry. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. 4 hours of me sitting in a victim's lounge with Patricia, watching reruns of shows I couldn't concentrate on, checking my phone for updates that never came, and trying not to imagine the worst-case scenarios. Prosecutor Williams had warned me, juries are unpredictable. Sometimes they find technical issues with evidence. Sometimes they sympathize with defendants. Sometimes they simply get it wrong. At 4:32 p.m., the court clerk informed us that the jury had reached a verdict. We filed back into the courtroom. My family sat at the defense table, their attorneys beside them looking resigned. Margaret's jaw was clenched. Derek was pale. My parents looked older than they had at the trial's beginning, as if 4 days of testimony had aged them years. The judge asked the jury foreperson to stand. The courtroom held its breath. On the charge of first-degree fraud, how do you find? Guilty, the foreperson said. The word hung in the air. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud? Guilty. Charge after charge. Guilty. 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 Margaret was convicted on all counts. Derek was convicted on all counts. My parents were convicted on all counts relating to financial fraud. My ex-husband would face prison time ranging from 3 to 7 years depending on sentencing. My sister would face 5 to 10 years. My parents, given their age, would face shorter sentences, but sentences nonetheless. When the judge announced that they would be remanded in custody pending sentencing, Margaret stood up and looked directly at me. Her face was a mixture of rage and shock and something that might have been regret. She mouthed something, I'm not certain what. An apology? A curse? An explanation that I would never fully understand? I didn't look away. I held her gaze until the bailiff led her out of the courtroom. My mother was crying openly now. My father looked broken in a way I'd never seen. These were the people who gave me life, and now they were being led away in handcuffs. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt devastated. Sentencing happened 3 weeks later. My family's attorneys had mounted appeals, but the evidence was incontrovertible. Margaret received 7 years. Derek received 5 years. My parents received 2 years each, with my father's sentence suspended due to his declining health. During the sentencing hearing, I sat in the front row again. Margaret made a statement before sentencing. A statement that I hoped would be an apology but which was, instead, a justification. Your Honor, she began, I acknowledge that my actions were criminal, but I want the court to understand the context. I was a struggling single mother after my divorce. I had student loan debt. I was working 60-hour weeks, and my sister had always had everything easily. She had the good career, the nice house, the financial security that I'd worked twice as hard to achieve and still never reached. When the opportunity presented itself, yes, I made a terrible choice. But it came from desperation, not from malice toward my sister. Prosecutor Williams had warned me about this. Defendants often try to reframe their crimes as desperate acts born from circumstance rather than from their own moral failures. The judge wasn't sympathetic. Your actions, the judge said coldly, show a calculated attempt to capitalize on tragedy. You didn't act once in desperation. You acted repeatedly, consistently, across multiple months and multiple financial vehicles. You forged documents. You manipulated your family. You showed no remorse until you were convicted. Desperation doesn't explain this pattern. Greed does. My father made a brief statement apologizing for his actions. His voice was weak, his words hollow. My mother didn't speak. My ex-husband expressed remorse that I didn't believe was genuine, and Derek's new wife, my former friend Crystal, was visible in the gallery looking furious. I wondered briefly if she'd been complicit or if she was another of Derek's victims. After sentencing, Prosecutor Williams hugged me in the courthouse hallway. You did the right thing, she said. But I wasn't sure if the right thing was supposed to feel this empty. 6 months after the sentencing, I was still living in that temporary apartment, still working with Dr. Harmony on processing everything. I'd gone back to nursing, though I requested a different floor. I couldn't face cardiac patients with the same presence I'd offered before. Every heartbeat felt too precious, too fragile, too easily lost. My apartment walls were starting to feel less temporary. I'd hung pictures, not family pictures but images that spoke to my recovery. A photograph of my hospital room in that foreign country. A picture of Elena, the nurse, who'd become a friend despite the language barrier. Images from the courtroom marking the day I reclaimed my narrative. Margaret had begun serving her sentence. Derek as well. My parents were out on reduced sentences, and I'd learned through mutual acquaintances that they were struggling. My father had suffered a minor stroke. My mother was on anxiety medication. They were living in a smaller apartment, their reputation destroyed in the community. Should I have felt satisfied? I didn't. Should I have felt powerful? Glad I felt sad. The civil case was still pending. I was suing for damages. The money they'd stolen, the costs of my medical care, the lost wages from my recovery period. My attorney said I had a strong case, that I could reclaim much of what I'd lost financially. The monetary restitution felt hollow against the emotional devastation. I received a letter from Margaret while she was in prison. I almost didn't open it. Patricia encouraged me to, saying it might provide closure. The letter was handwritten, her usual perfect script deteriorated by prison conditions. She wrote about how she'd been wrong, how she'd rationalized her actions through years of resentment, how seeing me walk into the courtroom had shattered her understanding of reality. She wrote about our childhood, about Jason's death, about how she'd never processed her grief correctly and had instead channeled it into anger toward me. "You reminded me of everything I was supposed to be," she wrote. "You succeeded where I struggled. And instead of being proud of my sister, I resented her. I'm so sorry, Nikira. I'm sorry for everything." I cried reading that letter, really wept, and then I didn't respond. Not because I couldn't forgive her, but because forgiveness felt too complicated for a prison mail system. Forgiveness needed time. Forgiveness needed distance. And I wasn't sure if I was capable of forgiving her for what she'd done, regardless of her reasons. 1 year after the accident, I stood in my new apartment. A real apartment that I'd purchased with the settlement money from my civil case. The walls were bare because I was still deciding who I wanted to be after everything. The kitchen was modest because I cooked for myself now, finding peace in the simplicity of nourishing my own body. I'd received a job offer at a prestigious hospital in a new city. A fresh start. The kind of opportunity that felt like redemption, like my story wasn't ending in darkness but transitioning into something new. The opportunity came with better pay, better benefits, a teaching position where I could mentor younger nurses. More importantly, it offered distance. I still had contact with Patricia and Elena. Real friendships built on truth and support, not obligation and history. I joined a support group for fraud survivors and found healing in collective narrative. I discovered that many people had family members who'd betrayed them under less dramatic circumstances, and their pain was equally valid. But my biological family? That door was closing. My parents had sent letters expressing their remorse. I'd acknowledged them with brief, cordial responses. My brother-in-law had visited me once, and we'd had a difficult but honest conversation about the family's dynamics. He was divorcing Margaret. Her conviction had been the final straw for him, and he was starting fresh as well. Derek had, from prison, sent a message through his attorney asking if I'd consider dropping the restraining order. I'd declined. Some connections need to be permanently severed, and I'd learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to refuse to be available for someone else's redemption narrative. The truth is, I survived. I'm not a victim, though I was victimized. I'm a survivor who chose to testify, who chose accountability, who chose not to hide from my own story. But I'm also someone with a broken family that will never be repaired. A woman whose parents chose money over their daughter and will die with that knowledge. A woman whose sister will spend years in prison contemplating her choices. A woman whose marriage was built on lies and resentment. The justice system gave me victory. But victory and happiness are not the same thing. Sometimes I think about that accident, about the 7 seconds that changed everything. I think about how different my life might have been if that truck had hit slightly to the left, if the impact had been fatal, if my family had succeeded in their conspiracy. I think about Elena finding my body and wondering who I was. But mostly I think about the person I'm becoming. Someone stronger but sadder, more resilient but more guarded, someone who knows that love and betrayal can wear the same face if you're not careful. I'm preparing to move to that new city tomorrow. My car is packed. My apartment is empty. My phone is filled with messages of support from people I've met through this process. People who've become my real family, my chosen family, the people who see me as something worth honoring rather than something worth exploiting. And as I look at my apartment one last time, I think about what I'd tell the people watching this story, the people asking me if justice was worth it, the people wondering if I could do it all again. I'd tell them this: justice is complicated. Family is complicated. Survival is complicated. But living authentically in the aftermath of betrayal? That's perhaps the most complicated thing of all. You have to learn who you are when the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally showed you that they loved money more. You have to rebuild your capacity to trust while knowing the most dangerous people are often the ones with your passwords and your social security numbers. You have to walk toward your future even though it means walking away from your past. That's what I'm doing now. Walking toward something unknown, something untethered from family obligation, something that might actually be freedom. To everyone out there considering their own reckoning with betrayal, your survival matters. Your story matters. Your decision to hold people accountable, even if they're family, matters. You have the right to protect yourself. You have the right to speak your truth. You have the right to live. Sometimes that means losing your family to gain your life. I'm choosing my life. Always, I will choose my life. If you or someone you know is experiencing family fraud or financial exploitation, resources are available. Reach out to local legal services, victim advocacy organizations, and mental health professionals who specialize in financial trauma. You're not alone and your experience is valid. Share this story if it resonates with you. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is let others know they're not the only ones who've walked this painful path.